Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you're listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, we will be looking at The Rise of the Fourth Political Theory by Alexander Dugin. This is the Fourth Political Theory, Volume 2. I've already reviewed the Fourth Political Theory, Volume 1, some time ago, and this book, to some extent, continues on the arguments of that book, although there's a lot in here that really talks about Russia, the state of Russia in the world. Dugin is very much a believer in a multipolar world, and so he talks about whether Russia is a civilization of its own or is a part of European civilization. He talks at a number of points about Russian history, Russian politics. That's not what this podcast is about. I don't want to get into an awful lot of detail about any of that material. I'm more interested in the things that he's talking about that are more relevant to the United States of America and the Fourth Political Theory and modernity. And so there's, I'm not going to talk an awful lot about quite a bit of the portions of this book, but there are a few parts, particularly Chapter 9 and Chapter 3, that I want to go into in some detail. And I also want to relate this book specifically back to some of the things that we've spoken about previously. In particular, the previous two episodes. So last episode was Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, and then the episode before that was John Dewey's Reconstruction in Philosophy. And I want to relate this back to those books, in particular their sort of view of the direction of the course of history. And I guess I'll say this. John Dewey was really a modernist. He was writing in the early 20th century before postmodernism. It was about 100 years ago that he was writing, that he wrote the book that I had read a couple episodes ago. And he was a liberal, although I don't believe that he considered himself to be a socialist. He was a sort of American liberal, of a sort of, I guess what we nowadays would probably call neoliberal, although being that it was 100 years ago, I'm not so sure how neo it was. But at any rate, it was sort of a classical liberal, I guess would be a good way to define John Dewey. He was a pragmatist. I disagree with a lot of things John Dewey says, but there's a fair number that I agree with as well, insofar as he's a pragmatist. I think that he misconstrues the application of pragmatism to real-world situations, but that's something that I'll get more into in various books when I talk specifically about John Dewey. The only point I want to make at this point about that is that he describes in that book a sort of ongoing progress of civilization. And so you could say he's a progressive. He believes that science in particular has carried mankind to better and better places. And the scientific process and a scientific understanding of the world has a generally positive effect on things. He thinks that the traditions of the world, the old ways of doing things are flawed through misunderstandings of the way the world works, and that all parts of tradition and history kind of need to be continually reevaluated and updated and repaired with new scientific information. I think he gets a lot wrong in his tendency to do that. But again, I don't want to get into too deep of a critique of John Dewey, but just to kind of say that that's where John Dewey is coming from, a sort of ever onward, ever upward, long-term process of civilization that he dates all the way back to beginning with the earliest Greek philosophers. And then the next book that I reviewed was The Decline of the West, which you can probably gather from the title has a different sort of an outlook on things. It's a book of decline. It's a book stating that something in some way was at a higher point and has degraded. And on first glance, you might think that he's talking about a sort of opposite of John Dewey, where there's this long civilizational decline. That's not really what Spengler is talking about. That probably corresponds more closely with Julius Evola's book, Revolt Against the Modern World, which I reviewed it some time ago, where he talks about an ongoing decline away from a higher state. And that decline really for Evola begins back with the ancient Greeks. So those two would really be the most polar opposites in regards to this ongoing progress versus an ongoing decline. Whereas what Spengler's talking about is the decline of the West specifically. So Spengler talks about multiple cultures and civilizations that rise and fall. So the ancient Greeks rose and fall. What he describes as the Magian or Arabic rise and fall, which corresponds to like the Middle Ages, and then the Faustian or Western rise and decline. So when he talks about the decline of the West, Spengler's talking about the decline of a specific culture/civilization, which he identifies as the West. He also identifies as Faustian. And so he kind of pins the beginning of that decline with around Rousseau. And I think that it seems as though the Faustian world described by Spengler really reaches its pinnacle in the Enlightenment. And then it entrenches itself as a civilization. It loses its creative vitality, kind of stagnates, and reaches a sort of a plateau where it's no longer growing or changing. It's just defending itself from new onslaughts, and it begins to degrade over time. With the loss of that vital spirit, it begins to turn on itself. And so when he talks about the decline of the West, he's really talking about this slow degrading of the Faustian/Western civilization. So for our purposes, let's just consider Faustian and Western to be essentially synonymous. He talks about the decline of the West, the decline of the Faustian civilization, same thing. So then as that culture declines, right, new cultures come up. It's like waves. Culture comes, culture goes, the next culture comes, that culture goes, the next culture comes, and so on and so forth. It's kind of repeating sequence of rise and fall of cultures and civilizations. And so as the West is in decline, we could expect that a new culture, a new cultural center would arise to replace it. And so that's really where this book comes in. The rise of the fourth political theory would be the rise of a new political mode, a new philosophical mode, a new cultural mode to replace the decline of Enlightenment, Faustian, Western world. So let's just, I like to kind of bundle for the purposes of this episode and maybe a couple other episodes. I want to make a sort of a rough bundle where we would say that Faustian, Western, Enlightenment, modern, and liberal culture are all more or less synonymous. So when you think of the Enlightenment, you're definitely talking about the rise of classical liberal thought. And that all ties in with modernity and modernism, which you could then say is either reaches its pinnacle in postmodernism, or you could even say is being replaced by postmodernism. But so in that sense, modern doesn't just mean that which is happening right now, but more broadly, it means a particular cultural set of norms and ways of looking at the world that we could identify as liberal or classically liberal. So in that sense, it doesn't mean what's happening right now, because otherwise, if you're just talking about modernity and modern as that which is happening right now, then postmodern becomes kind of nonsensical concept. Postmodern it makes sense only when you consider it's after modernity, and modernity being defined by a specific set of ideas, which actually is not necessarily always the dominant worldview. So with the decline of the West, we then move into something new, which is only just being created, only just being defined now, and is in sort of a state of flux as to what this post-liberal culture or order would look like. And those are the ideas that Dugin brings up in his books. He talks about really three competitors: liberalism, communism, and fascism. But liberalism having come first, communism and fascism are in some ways derivative of liberalism. They have their own basis that is, built on liberal ideas. But he basically says communism and fascism have both failed or been defeated, and liberalism has won the day and has taken over and has become kind of a universal culture that no longer has any competitors, and so becomes a sort of a default way of being for not just the West, meaning geographically like Western Europe and places that were colonized by people from Western Europe, but specifically like a culture that has overcome the whole world or is in the process of overcoming the whole world and becoming the default for everyone everywhere. But he kind of says that's not necessarily the best way that we want to be, all homogenized, operating according to the exact same cultural norms everywhere and at all times. So I guess at this point I'll jump in and start reading some of the parts. Like all my episodes, there are components of the book that I'm just going to read out loud to you and then comment on so that you can really get it straight from the source of what he's talking about. And so that's chapter 9, and then I'll read a little bit out of chapter 3. Chapter 9 is called Questioning Modernization. So this is the one really where he talks about what modernity and modernization are. In this section, he says, quote, "Today, few understand that the term modernization consists of two parts. On the one hand, there is technical modernization. More than any other, it is this aspect of modernization that catches the eye. It is embodied in new devices, aircraft, communication technologies, and means for receiving money, in new materials, information technologies, and nanotechnologies. The object of this modernization is to provide instruments and means that simplify a person's life and make the world more comfortable, convenient, fast, effective, and joyful. Make it a friendly and user-friendly interface, as computer people say. This interface undoubtedly depends on technical modernization. But there is also another side of modernization, which historically, as a rule, is intimately connected with the first: moral, cultural, and social modernization. If the object of the first modernization is the development of instruments, in the second case it is the development of the narad, society, government, morals, customs, values, and culture. Modernization of this kind has a completely different significance. For instance, the modernization of morals is a rejection of traditional values. At first, a rejection of church marriage, then a rejection of marriage, which is replaced by a kind of civil authority, then the permission of homosexual marriage, and then entirely logically the complete abolition of the institution of marriage, and polygamy becomes the social norm. This is the natural path of the modernization of the family. There is no other modernization of the family. If we want to modernize the institution of the family, we will have to corrupt its traditional norms and adopt new ones. Cultural modernization proceeds along the same path. Traditionally, religious art was the fundamental culture: religious paintings, religious literature, religious liturgy. Modernizing this, we came to the period of secular culture, and then to the avant-garde, culminating in all the postmodernist fragments of the world, organized in an accidental manner, which are now also elements of culture. Moral modernization leads to the disintegration of traditional relations between people. Each person becomes for himself and does not recognize any societal or social norms. Thus, modernization in these spheres signifies a repudiation of conservative foundations, of traditional forms, of morality, a traditional worldview, religious norms, the values of the family, the collective, the narad, the ethnos, the community. That is, everything that constitutes the collective identity of people. This is modernization, and it coincides with technical modernization. Both are named in accordance with the same attributes: progress, improvement, and development." End quote. Okay, so the main thing that I want to extract out of that section was the split between two different types of modernization, a technical modernization and a social and cultural and moral modernization, which could really just say the social modernization, the change in our technologies, our devices, our means of accomplishing things, and then changes in how we think about things, how we relate to one another. And a lot of this comes down to the atomization of people, the hyper-individualization, the elimination of collective organizations or groups, the elimination of anything that would impose any sort of duty upon one. This sort of liberal modernization really comes down to prioritizing consent so that one can have no obligations or duties that one has not consented to. It's a hyper-atomization, hyper-individualization, and as we'll see, he's really deeply, deeply opposed to the second and all of the corrosive damage it does to traditional institutions. And there's certainly a lot to be said for that critique. There is a lot of damage and destruction that is done by modernization to all of the traditional ways of life. You know, we all know, and I've said before, it's much easier to break things than it is to build them. And insofar as modernization requires all traditional things to be broken and dismantled and at the very least deeply criticized and examined, it's damaging in that regard, and there's no real guarantee that any of the cultural replacements that modernism and liberalism bring to us can really adequately fill the gap, can adequately provide a replacement culture. I think there are many ways in which it simply can't, because things that are traditional, that have existed for a long time or have their roots in the deep past, they have existed for many years because they have proven themselves successful. I believe there's sort of an evolutionary quality in tradition where the things that we have that our culture has carried with it for many years, it has done so specifically because those things have been successful, have proven their worth. And crafting new cultural norms out of reason and logic might not really take into account certain ways in which, the rubber meets the road, when those sort of contrived civilizational structures meet reality. Do they always work correctly? Just because it looks good on paper doesn't mean it works in reality. I think we can all accept that. There's unintended consequences. That's one of the fundamental principles of conservatism, is that you always need to concern yourself with the potential for unintended consequences, which is why you approach change prudently and carefully. So, with that said, I want to move to the next section here, also from chapter 9. And in this section, he's talking a little bit about religion. So here he says, quote, "Everyone knows Nietzsche's popular formula, God is dead. However, many do not know how this phrase ends. You have killed him, you and I. Desiring progress in modernization, people killed God. People paid for the possibility of their own material development and unlimited development in the moral and social spheres with the death of God. This is a very honest and correct view of Nietzsche's, who is not one to deplore or blame someone. He simply calls things by their names. In order for modernized man to appear, it was necessary to remove God from his pedestal. In this lies the godless essence of humanism, about which many philosophers of the 19th and 20th centuries spoke. In the process of modernization, the autonomous man appeared and started to call himself free. Thus, the struggle against God is inevitably an element of modernity. This is still not the end. When this free autonomous man appeared, started to spread his peculiar humanistic culture with self-reliance, and completely developed his technological might, social institutions, ungodly liberal democracy, and other discoveries of social cultural modernization, in that very moment, postmodern philosophers denounced modernity, declaring that man had now become God. But from the point of view of postmodernism, divinized man also creates repressive hierarchies. And so then there arose the idea of killing man himself. One well-known French philosopher, Bernard Henry Levy, proclaimed the death of man. Another philosopher, Roland Barthes, proclaimed the death of the author. Society without people and texts without authors became the norms of contemporary postmodern culture. Thus, man at first killed God, and then, in the search for newer and newer modernization, new liberation, he reached the point that he became a burden to himself. There arose the ideas of the rhizome, the indeterminate half-tuber, the cyborg, and the clone. All of this is the logical outcome of modernization. This post-human is a necessary element of modernization. After all, postmodernism is what happens after modernization has been implemented. In those countries where the cycle of modernity has ended, active postmodernization has begun. Industrialization passed, post-industrialization started. Modernization passed, post-modernization started. Now they want to drag Russia into this too, but there is nothing good in this besides the development of technical means. On one side of the scale are glowing windows, neon lights, TV screens, and household appliances. On the other, the life of man, his fate, his soul, his love, his fear, his air, contact with nature, with his children, and the great historical projects that people set themselves. End quote. Okay, so there's a lot in there. I want to dig into a little bit. One thing that I think is important, an important statement, is when he says that in order for modernized man to appear, it was necessary to remove God from his pedestal. So, if you've been listening to the show, you know that I'm an atheist. I'm a secular person. And I think it's important to point out that there's a cause and effect component to this that I think, in my opinion, is often confused. A lot of conservatives will say that once we abandoned God, right, all of the sort of degradation and decline of society was the natural result of that rejection of God. But Dugin seems to be saying here, and I would agree, that what's really going on is that in order to completely modernize, in order to completely advance and dismantle all of traditional things to replace them with logics and science, it was necessary to remove God from much of society. So God is not the removal of God, the death of God, whatever you want to call it, the secularization of society didn't create modernity. Modernity created the secularization of society. And so, given that fact, I don't think that it becomes a necessary case that in order to escape from the worst excesses of modernity, a return to God is necessary or even sufficient. People think that a return to God is going to, if leaving God has created all of this, then returning to God undoes all of this. That seems to be a common notion. But I don't know as though that's the case. I think that it's entirely possible that people will create for themselves a new type of God that is able to be, absorbed into modernity. And, you see a lot of Christian churches that have very thoroughly just embraced modernity. So it may be the case that it's not entirely necessary to drive God out of society to have modernity, it just becomes necessary to fundamentally transform God. And I also think it's the case that we're not going to be able to completely abandon every aspect of modernity. Like Dugin specifies in this section that there are parts of, well, let me see exactly what he says. He says, now they want to drag Russia into this. There's nothing good in this besides the development of technical means. So in some sense, He says that there are good parts of modernity, and some of the good parts of modernity are specifically the technological aspects. We don't necessarily want to abandon all technology or completely abandon all science and the scientific process. That's not the goal in recovering from the damage that modernity has done. It's not necessary to completely abandon science. So there's parts of modernity that we're going to have to keep and parts of it that we're going to have to get rid of. And we're going to have to be wise in determining which is which. And I'm of the opinion that we're going to have to move into a different form of religious belief. I don't know as though far be it from me to tell people what their beliefs about God should be. But I certainly think that it's viable, and I would say important, to develop a sort of religious sense that doesn't depend on belief in Abrahamic, which is ultimately Jewish religious systems. I mean, all of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam is really dependent upon the Jewish faith as being the originator of the concept of God. When we talk about God, we're talking about the God who created Adam and Eve, right? The God who flooded the world and provided Noah with the foreknowledge to build the ark. We're talking about the God of Abraham. We're talking about, Yahweh or however you call the monotheistic deity when people talk about God. And I don't know as though it's entirely necessary that we return to that or adhere to that in order to combat the worst excesses of modernity. I think that there can and must be another way, another form of religion that can adopt the parts of modernity that are worthwhile while still recognizing and rejecting the parts of modernity that are damaging. So anyway, that's certainly a hefty project to try to undertake, and I'll just leave it at that for now. Move on to the next section here. He's talking a little bit more about the technology aspect of all of this. He says, quote, "It is necessary to disenchant the term modernization. After all, when someone says modernization, everyone is right away for it, and he who is against it is retrograde, an old-fashioned, archaic, backward man. But we must have the same suspicion toward those people who are unequivocally for modernization, inasmuch as modernization is the death of God, and then the death of man, the death of the author, the rhizome, cyborgs, clones, and genetic operations. For now, they are still somehow held in check. The EU even proposes to restrict experiments on the human genetic code, and this is a very dangerous thing, but this only speaks to the fact that such experiments are somewhere being performed. The logic of modernization is that one wants to keep it held in check, but it cannot be held in check. And so-called liberated technique awaits us. People start to look like robots. They're not yet robots, they are ordinary people, but there is a plan to gradually integrate into humans more and more mechanical implants, prosthetic devices, computer processors, and microchips to help their organs work. This is good for invalids, but humanity will not stop at this. Humanity never stopped and acted judiciously. If it enters onto the path of modernization, it travels this path to the end. A person never understands limits, he always passes beyond them, in the good and the evil. His actions will never fall into the golden mean. Soon our kids will confuse a replica with a living person. Thus it is very important to separate modernization from that unconditional ecstasy with which we usually greet it. If Russia needs modernization, then it should be of its own kind, a national modernization, taking into account all our conditions. We must distinguish the technical and moral sides of modernization, since in the religious, moral, and cultural aspects, modernization is simply destruction and perversion. If we separate these two concepts, that will already be good." End quote. All right, so this is sort of a challenging to come to terms with. He's saying that modernization, well, he says that humans never just stop. He says it would be good if we, to adopt some components of modernization, but people think that they can keep it in check. They can hold it from going overboard. He says, for now, it's somehow still held in check. But he also says, humanity will not stop at this. Humanity never stopped and acted judiciously. If it enters onto the path of modernization, it travels the path to the end. A person never understands limits. But then he also says, if Russia needs modernization, then it should be of its own kind, a national modernization, taking into account, etc., etc. And he says we must distinguish the technical and moral sides of modernization. He says basically that the religious, moral, and cultural aspects of modernization are simply destruction and perversion. So if we take this division of modernization into the technical and the cultural sides of it, he says that the cultural, moral sides of modernization is nothing but destruction and perversion, and that aspect of it should be completely rejected. And then in the technical side of modernization, it would have to be a sort of distinct Russian national modernization. At the same time, though, he does say that people never just go halfway, they always go all the way. And so how could it be that Russia could have any sort of modernization but not the complete modernization of all parts of human life? How could it ever be restrained just to the technical and not enter into the realm of the cultural and moral? And so I think that the simple fact is it must be held in check. I think he's wrong. I think he's partly right. People don't just stop. They just go all the way, and we see that in our own world. There's never any real debate, with the exception of maybe fiddling with the human genetic code. There is, the more cutting edge the technology becomes, the more invasive and altering of humanity the technology becomes, the more cyborg-like the technology becomes, the more we tend to say, I'm, beginning to get skeptical. We start getting into the uncanny realm of, quasi-human, not entirely machines, the cyborg world, where the AI that, is so intelligent and so capable of seeming like a human. And he talks about how, our kids won't be able to tell the difference between people and simulacra. And we have to wonder, even right now, you see something on television, you can't always be certain, is this real or computer generated? It's becoming so indistinguishable. And that's only today. What will it be like in 50 years as artificial intelligence advances, as virtual reality advances, as our integration with machines advances, the ability to alter the human genetic code through biological technologies advances. So it's a dangerous game, and we're very unlikely. Again, I think this is changing, but we tend to be somewhat unlikely, with the exception of particular aspects of society that never really have an awful lot of say. On the whole, we don't really stop and say, let's pump the brakes a little bit and see how this affects us. Let's see what it's like to stare at our phones all day long on social media. Let's, see what that does to us. Let's even, before we see what it does to us, let's stop and think about, is this a good idea? Is civilization, is humanity an ongoing experiment? The sort of prudence before we jump in headfirst into things, on the one hand, is very uncommon, and yet, on the other hand, is entirely necessary. And so we have to be skeptical about modernization, both in its technological aspects as well as in its sociological aspects. What does it mean for our birth rates, for example, when there's a whole host of aspects of modernization in the social, moral, cultural realm that discourage the creation of families, that We've got all new technologies, abortion technologies, birth control technologies. We've got social norms of increasing homosexuality and increasing desire for women to have their whole career almost to a point of fulfillment before they even consider having children. But your career isn't fulfilled until, you're in your 40s before you really reach the point where most people, where they really feel like they've made it. And so we've got a situation where for many women, we put off birth until the last possible moment. What does this do to our birth rates? Well, all these things. What do all these things do to our birth rates? Is it sustainable? Is it a good idea? Is it a good idea for us to do that to our birth rates when other cultures are not doing that to their own? There's all kinds of unintended consequences from all of these aspects of modernization. So just as much as for Russia, he says Russia has to have its own sort of modernization that is more skeptical and more tentative. As an American, I feel like we, just as much as anybody else, need to begin to be skeptical about modernization. And so that was the last section about questioning modernization from chapter 9. And then I want to read a little bit out of chapter 3, not a tremendous amount. Talk a little bit about that. So here, chapter 3 is called The West and Its Challenge. And in this section, he says, quote, "Because within the borders of Europe itself, the more avant-garde areas of development of the paradigm of modernity were such countries as England, Holland, and France, located west of Central and especially Eastern Europe, the concepts Europe and the West gradually became synonyms. The properly speaking European culture, as different from other cultures, consisted precisely in the transition from traditional society to the society of modernity, while this, in turn, occurred first of all in the European West. Thus, from the 17th to the 18th centuries, the term the West acquired a precise civilizational sense, becoming a synonym of modernity, modernization, and progress, social, industrial, economic, and technological development. From now on, all that was involved in the process of modernization was automatically attached to the West. Modernization and Westernization proved to be synonymous. The identity of modernization and Westernization requires some clarifications, which will lead us to very important practical conclusions. The issue is that the formation in Europe of the unprecedented civilization of the modern era led to a particular cultural arrangement, which at first formed the self-consciousness of the Europeans themselves, and later also of all of those who found themselves under their influence. The sincere conviction grew that the path of development of Western culture, and especially the transition from traditional society to contemporary society, was not only a peculiarity of Europe and the peoples that populate it, but a universal law of development, obligatory for all other countries and peoples. Europeans, people of the West, were the first to pass through this decisive phase, but all others are thought fatally doomed to go along the same path, because this is the supposedly objective logic of world history. The idea arose that the West is the obligatory model of the historical development of all mankind and world history, as in the past, so in the present and future, was and is conceived of as a repetition of those stages that the West, in its development, already passed through, or is presently approaching, in advance of all others. In all places where Europeans encountered non-Western cultures, which preserved traditional society and its way, Europeans made an unequivocal diagnosis: barbarism, savagery, backwardness, absence of civilization, subnormality. Thus, gradually, the West became the idea of a normative criterion for the evaluation of the peoples and cultures of the entire world. The further they were from the West in its newest historical phase, the more defective and inferior they were thought to be." End quote. All right, so that section there, basically, he is talking about something that I had sort of alluded to previously, which is this identification between modernization and the West, specifically Western Europe, such that the countries of Western Europe, Germany, France, England, he lists Holland, were really the origins of modernity. So modernization arose there, and it became the idea in the West that that was the natural course of history, was moving toward greater and greater technological progress, moving towards greater and greater modernity, liberalism. And we look to other countries outside of Europe, and we evaluate them based on how much of the Western modern paradigm, the liberal paradigm, that they have adopted. Anything that has not adopted this liberal paradigm is viewed as backwards, barbaric, primitive, and so on and so forth. The presumption is that everyone, everywhere, is going to go through the same process of modernization, and that Western Europe simply reached it first. And we help the world insofar as we help them move along the same cultural and technological track that we went along, or we meaning the West. And, he's very critical of this idea. It's a sort of cultural supremacy, the liberal supremacy. What the West has done is the greatest. And not only is it great, but it's also necessary for all other peoples to follow along the same track. And this creates a sort of a quasi-global empire he talks about a little bit. It really manifests in a global homogenization, that everywhere you go, you see the same thing. Every city, the buildings look the same architectural styles, the same types of clothing people wear, the same types of music people listen to. It becomes a very similar culture everywhere, and it's not even entirely European any longer. Traditional European components of this culture are driven out. It's modernity. It's a sort of placeless, deracinated culture. It's, in a sense, American, insofar as America has largely become the exporter of culture. But it's not even really American. Many of the earlier, more traditional aspects of American society that hadn't necessarily fully embraced liberalism and modernity are driven out. And the objective, of course, is for it to be universal, to not necessarily be associated as American or Western. We don't like to think of the westernization of the world so much as we think of the progress of the world coming into the modern era. Modernization of the world is how we prefer to identify it and understand it. But it is, in many senses, a westernization of the world, and should be acknowledged in that way. And so insofar as Dugin is a multipolarist, he believes that Russia, as well as other civilizational centers, need to find their own way and no longer consider the process of modernization as the objective, but more a self-actualization, that Russia could be Russia in its own terms and have its own form of modernization, and other places elsewhere in the world would have their own modernization only up to and no further than they would prefer to carry it. And it wouldn't necessarily be an aping or a copying of European modernization, but it would be its own version, or perhaps no version at all. Perhaps a culture would completely reject all aspects of modernization, and that every culture everywhere should be free to do that. If they don't want to embrace westernization or modernization, they find their own way. This is really the core of the multipolar world that Dugin talks about. And so I think those were all the parts that I wanted to read. I just want to briefly mention one last thing, which is when he talks about Russia, like I said, I don't really want to get into the details of Russian politics or Russian society, but he does bring up the question of whether or not Russia is a part of Europe or is its own civilizational entity. And he kind of considers maybe yes, maybe no. He looks at some of the similarities between Russia and Europe, and then he looks at some of the differences, and ultimately he comes to the conclusion that no, Russia actually is its own unique civilization and has to chart its own path and not append itself to Europe. And I can understand why he says that, but I think that from my perspective, obviously I'm not a Russian, I don't have nearly as authoritative a voice on any of this as he does, but you have to wonder why he doesn't ever ask the question, is Russia a part of Chinese civilization or Asian civilization, which is Russia's other neighbor? But it's clear that, I mean, it's not even a question worth asking, is Russia a part of China or Chinese civilization? It's clearly not. It's a nonsensical question. But if you look at Russia, all of the civilizational centers, the population centers, the cultural centers are all along the western Russia adjacent to Europe. And there are many, many historical ties between Russia and Europe. Ethnic ties, cultural ties, language ties, religious ties, ties of mutual interaction that go back centuries. Russia's deeply bound up with Europe in a way that it's simply not bound up with China. And I think that fact alone should indicate that Russia has a sort of special relationship with Europe and with the West even. And I guess I'm of the opinion that the future distinctions that the world is in the process of forming and will continue to form are going to look a lot more like the global North in opposition to the global South. And I think that because of the various cultural ties that bind Russia with Europe and with the rest of quote-unquote the West, it would be better to re-envision the world in the sense of North and South. And the concept of the West is becoming more and more meaningless as people all over the world identify themselves as being to some greater or lesser extent a part of Western civilization. You're no longer talking about Western Europe per se. And as it's also becoming the case that in the same way that Western Europe influences Eastern Europe, it's also becoming the case that Eastern Europe is having its own influence on Western Europe. And you'll find that there are people in France who have many political and cultural similarities with people in, let us say, Poland or Hungary, more so than they have cultural affinity with their own neighbors, who may be of different ethnic stock, may be of different religions, may be of diametrically opposed political ideas. It may be the case that people in England, France, Germany, Spain, Western European nations identify themselves culturally with other people in other countries. But those usually lie in the North. I mean, if you're speaking of a particular aspect of Western civilization, I guess what I'm saying is there are ideological differences and there are cultural differences, and in a way, people are sort of lining themselves up with a quasi-right and a quasi-left, and the right tends to associate itself with other northern nations. And the left is beginning more and more to reject the northern nations entirely and all of the values of the North and identify with the South. And I think that this is something that's just beginning to form itself. But for people on the political right, I believe it's smart to begin to identify not with the West per se, when you can look at the West and say, well, the West is the birth of modernization and all the worst aspects of modernization, and the West is the birthplace of postmodernism, and the West is the birthplace of communism, and various other things that we think might be destructive to civilization. Do we really want to say, we identify most closely with the West, or do we want to say we identify more closely with the North? I think it's the latter. Anyhow, I'm going to let that wrap up this episode. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll talk to you next time.